Good evening, everyone, and very warm welcome to you on behalf of the University of Bradford and the Department of Peace Studies and International Development. We have a lot of people online as well as people in the room. So welcome to people who joined us online. I can't actually see how many people there are currently. So you probably don't need an introduction either to the department or to Paul, but I'm going to do one anyway, especially for the benefit of people online who might be newer to the university. So many of you will know that the Department of Peace Studies and International Development was established at Bradford in 1973 with financial support from the Quakers, who funded the establishment of the first chair in peace studies at the university. And we recently celebrated our 50th anniversary. I'm not sure, maybe some of you came to some of the events that we had then. A very nice celebration of that 50 years of work. The department evolved over the coming years into one of the largest dedicated centres for peace research, offering a wide range of undergraduate and postgraduate courses and attracting students from all over the UK and from many parts of the world. The department's been quite unique, I think, particularly because of being a very interdisciplinary centre for research and teaching. Our staff have backgrounds in many different subject areas, from politics, international relations, geography, economics, development studies, and many other areas. And some, like Paul, started their careers in very different subject areas, and then before moving into peace research. That interdisciplinarity is reflected in the courses that we teach, not just the variety of programs we offer. We have quite a number of different programs, but also in an ethos that recognises that many of the issues that we study connected to peace and violence require different kinds of knowledge. The department's research is also very wide-ranging, from the study of civil wars and peace and conflict-affected societies through to things like microfinance for development and how to develop sustainable cities. The other thing that's probably defined the department is an interest in applied work. Many of our staff have made important contributions to policy and practice through their engagement with governments, international agencies, and non-governmental organisations. Many of our students, and we're really proud of this, also go on to work in the related areas of peace and sustainability work internationally. That's a little bit about the department. If there's anyone who wants to find out more, please do get in touch with us, especially if you're interested in some of our courses. Paul probably also doesn't need very much of an introduction to you, and I think it's clear from the number of people joining us today that his reputation is very well known. However, I'm going to do a bit of formal introduction and a few comments of my own. So Paul is Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford and an Honorary Fellow of the Joint Service Command and Staff College. Paul came to Peace Studies in 1979 and stayed as a staff member until 2016, including a key period as head of department from 1993 to 1999, a period that really saw the expansion and consolidation of the department. Paul has written or edited 30 books and more than 150 scholarly works, including the books Losing Control, Global Security in the 21st Century, Irregular War, New Threats from the Margins, and his most recent book, The Insecurity Trap. Paul's writing's been translated into multiple languages, and he remains an active public intellectual, delivering around 150 media interviews annually and writing regular columns, which I'm sure many of you follow, for Open Democracy and the Oxford Research Group. I think that record of public engagement and public education is unmatched. I know that anytime I mention peace studies to somebody that I meet for the first time, it's quite likely that it's Paul that they've heard of. So I don't know if Paul would consider himself a systems thinker, but what I found particularly valuable in Paul's work, apart from his tremendous clarity of thought and communication, is his ability to see the bigger picture and most importantly, how different issues and challenges connect and interact. A lot of our academic work, for good reason, often tends to look at social or environmental issues in isolation, but Paul has been consistent in highlighting the interactions between and the security implications of growing wealth inequality, environmental and other limits to growth, or a reliance on economic growth to try and solve social and political problems, and the impacts of climate change. This more holistic view helps us to recognise and take a more critical perspective on some underlying patterns and deeper causes of events or developments in the world. Paul's work's also been often described as prescient or visionary, recognising very early on, for example, that military interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11 would not just fail to achieve their stated objectives, but complicate and worsen the situations in most places. So I think that brings us to tonight's theme. I think, as I say, lots of people are here probably not just because of Paul's reputation, but also with what can feel like quite overwhelming and disorienting changes in the world, and people looking for some guidance with some of these complex challenges. And I think that is to the question and theme that we're going to explore tonight. Just where is the world going? Paul Rogers.
Okay to do it from here, is it? Thanks very much, Reese, and thanks very much for those very kind words. Is my voice okay at the back?
Yes.
That's good. Brilliant when the hands go up. It's a risk to do a talk like this, frankly, because there's so many things going on and so many changes. And I rather guarantee that when we come to the questions, 90% of the times I will say I don't know the answer. But every time I will need to try and say something and point in a direction, but don't expect anything more than that. I'll speak probably for about 40 minutes. If I go in any longer, Reese, then give me a kick, because in a subject like this, it's much more the discussion that counts. I know we may have a couple of hundred people viewing in from outside, but it's very much a hybrid, so we're hoping that people will ask questions here and indeed contribute. I hope that's okay. So where do we start? I don't know. I suppose you've got to try and simplify it a bit. And what I'd say is that looking at the world developments as a whole, you can do something in terms of simplifying them by cutting them into three themes, which you can broadly label environment, economy, and security. Environment may well cover major health issues like, pandemics. Economy may cover bitter resentment of people on the margins. And as for security, well, if you look at it internationally, the experience of the last few years have been pretty dire, to put it mildly. The other thing is that all three of them, in my view, interact very strongly. And I hope we'll see that in the discussion. But let me start off by taking them in turn: environment, economy, and security. And they're just individual sort of perceptions which I'm sharing. I'm not claiming that, this is hugely important, but it's just an attempt by one person with the marvellous opportunity over the last 40 years to talk to so many people coming through the Peace Studies Department. I just met a few of our students earlier this afternoon, and I think there were 10 from 10 different countries. And it's that kind of thing, which is I found a huge learning experience in my own life. Environment. When I finished working in tropical agriculture, which where I'm originated, I got a job teaching environmental science at one of the polytechnics, very experimental. It's a course which we call human engineering. And I came across some of my notes recently. And essentially, these were on the rather sort of grand title of biogeochemical cycles. You'll probably remember the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, and the rest. There's also something called the carbon cycle. That is the way that carbon does actually circulate to an extent in the atmosphere. And just reading through the notes, I came to the end about a speculation, and this was in 1972. So this would be, 53 years ago. I did say right at the end, there's a probability that as carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, it will have effect on the climate, which may have a wide effect internationally. So that's over 50 years ago. We've known about this for a long time. Even the level of a sort of a dropping environmental lecturer actually having it in his notes. This wasn't just sort of research level, it was always already becoming into common knowledge. We're far down that path now. And certainly my own view is that if you look at all the major challenges facing humanity, even including the things like pandemics and the risk of a nuclear confrontation, I would say that climate breakdown is the main one. It's the most important one overall, because we know it's happening and we know it's accelerating. And it's going to be pretty disastrous if we're not careful. I don't know if any of you have come across this new Danish series that the BBC is showing on, I think it's Channel 4. I think it's maybe into the second or third segment, I'm not quite sure. I only picked it up a couple of days ago. It's called Families Like Us, Families Like Ours. It's basically telling the experience of a pretty average, we believe, Danish family. But what is happening is in Denmark is the government has decided to take the decision to evacuate the entire country. It's doing this because of rising waters and more flooding. And in what comes out is this has been talked about for several years. It's been developing probably for 10 or 20 years. And they've already got to the point where the Netherlands has virtually been lost and the Netherlands economy has collapsed. So the Danes are thinking ahead and they're going to do it sort of in advance when it's still reasonably feasible to do. But what comes across very clearly, and just from body language, one or two people have been watching as well, in my view, what comes across very clearly is the ordinaries of a family life, but applied in exceptional circumstances, with it clearly coming up unseen and unrecognized. And then people are surprised when the government finally takes this decision, even as being, in a sense, forecast in many ways. And I suppose this is one of the issues on the climate side. More people are taking it very seriously, but it's still a very small number. It's mostly younger people. Against that, we have a very strong movement, which I have to say is largely guided by the fossil carbon industries, with huge funding going into presenting a different view. And the view basically is there isn't a major problem. If climate is changing, it's due to natural causes, and we can handle things like that by carbon capture. In other words, there's no need to consider moving away from coal, oil and gas. And it's a very strongly view, and it's taken root among many politicians, essentially broadly on the right. And essentially you see it very much with the way in which the Trump administration in the United States is currently systematically closing down all the federal work which relates to the environment and climate. And it's doing it at a remarkable rate. Basically, they're going to more or less give up at this at the state level. At the state level, they can't, sorry. At the federal level, they're going to. It will continue at state level and from foundations, but it will be not for six in terms of what is done. And although the United States is not the only country doing very good work on this, you look at the centres in Germany and indeed Britain as well, and France and elsewhere, and some very good ones in the global south. Essentially, it's going to knock a hole in the whole scientific basis of understanding what's happening. So we've got a very big problem there. And this, I think, is a central one. We'll explore it later on. What we already know, of course, it is going to basically shift huge numbers of population. People are going to become much more desperate to move. The main reasons for movements at present tend to be on basic economic differentials, and of course wars as the rest, and different forms of persecution. But the need to move because of collapse of climates is actually going to be really significant. I was struck by this a few years ago in a rather unusual venue. I've been invited down just to do a broad introduction of world trends to a conference down at Bradford College in Oxford. And it was for British diplomats and the rest of, so I was told. And really, they had a very good group of people who knew all about states which were experiencing problems. And all they wanted was somebody to set the day in motion. And it's marvelous to me, I could just do that and listen to people who are experts in some of the most, I suppose, risked parts of the world, where there are really risks of instability. What they really wanted to work out was what would be the risk from unstable states and maybe collapsing states to Britain, economically, socially, the rest. I didn't actually know what the audience was. but it turned out to be the commandant and all the senior officers of the SAS, the SBS, and other branches of the Special Forces. And this is occasional seminars that they have to look ahead at what sort of wars they're going to be fighting in the near future. I certainly, it struck me in listening to the news this morning about what is coming out into the open about the persistence of the SAS being little more than a killing machine in Afghanistan, and we already knew it was in Iraq. But essentially, they were looking ahead from their perspective as serving military who had to protect the country by means that they think fit. And essentially, they saw this as significant. What also was clear during the day was the first person to follow me was a very sharp, very well-informed analyst from Islamic Relief, which is one of the major aid agencies in Britain. We tend to forget this. It's based in Birmingham, London. It's a very important agency. And she made the point during her speech, she referred to what I was saying about climate change. And she said in her experience in Islamic Relief, working in many of the semi-arid countries, one of the things that was constantly getting reported to the centre, and this was about 7 or 8 years ago, was the issue of harvests deteriorating because of lack of rain. It was always becoming the single biggest issue for the entire movement. That really was a sort of coming from a very unusual angle. So this is a really major issue. At the same time, this is one area, in fact, I would say of one of the areas of those 3 broad themes where there is very clearly hope. And that is that we know far more about how the climate works, much more to learn, but much more than we did. And one of the things is we now have, well, they have, the climate scientists have much more faith in the models that they've done. I mean, one of the tricks you use in climate research is you erect a model, say in 2005, 20 years ago. You go back to that model and get the factors that you predicted what would happen in 20 years and see if they succeeded. And if they didn't, then why didn't they predict correctly what would happen? And the thing is, you do that even just sort of 5 or even 10 years ahead. And broadly speaking, on that basis, the confidence that many climate scientists have in what they're saying is higher. They believe now they got it. It's not right, but it's better than it was. And as a result, they are much more worried than they were. And what you do notice is climate scientists much more willing to bluntly speak truth to not so much general power, but the general public. And essentially, that I think is a very good sign. We do see among younger people much more concern on the climate side, but perhaps the most important thing of all is the transformation that is happening, which is partly technological in the ability to use electricity generated from basically non-carbon sources. And the space that is developing, the pace that is developing is quite remarkable. One of our sons is a lecturer in renewable energy engineering down at Nottingham Trent University, so I tend to keep up to date with him. And essentially, the costs have really just almost collapsed in some areas. My wife for many years was saying we really needed to get a solar array, PV array on our house, which had a sloping roof facing almost south. She succeeded eventually about 12, 13 years ago. And it was a standard 3.8 kilowatt array. And essentially, it cost a lot of money. It cost £11,500. But at the same time, this is when the government gave a very generous feed-in tariff, and that would give you a payback within about 11 or 12 years, which is pretty good in terms of economic payback. So it has done that, actually. But the point is that costing £11,500. We got a neighbour who's just had a system fitted, including a large battery, for under £5,000, or similar size. So that is the change that has happened already. So what this does mean is if we were to get our act together, whether here, very importantly across the global south, we will find ourselves in the situation where changes could happen very, very quickly indeed. And indeed, in some parts of the world, they are. Some countries like Barbados and the rest, small scale, but it's model, are actually doing this pretty quickly. And it is not hugely expensive. And that is the point. So the possibility of positive change there is actually really very good. If we can get the political change worldwide to speed up the entire process. I'll come back towards the end, but essentially I wanted to get that down really at the start. If we go then on to the second part, which is the economy, I want to take you back to October 1973. Prior to that, the late 60s and very early 70s, The world, I'm watching Anand here because he's an economist. The world is broadly divided into two economic models. One would have been the Keynesian model, and the other would have been the central planning model, broadly the Soviet cum Chinese model. One very rigid from the top, the other less rigid, but also tended to go for mixed economies with a fair element of welfare in them. Now, it's nothing like enough. And you could say that, the way in which you had the decolonization of the global south was done massively in the interest of the northern countries. And what you had was economic systems which basically helped the northern countries, the global north. But at the same time, there was also a model which always had its eye on what the Soviets were doing. And so this was one of the reasons why you had a fairly large element of welfare built into it. More so in some countries. I think Britain was one of the leaders here, as it happened in the 5 or 6 years of the Labour government in the late 1940s, where you actually had the creation of a pretty general welfare state, including education and the rest. But that was true to men across many countries in the global north. And that was true really into the early 1970s, bearing in mind many inequalities as well. What happened in October 1973, some of us are old enough to remember, was the outbreak of the Yom Kippur Ramadan War. One of the things that happened there was the Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, used their oil first time in history as a weapon to try and get political change. What they wanted, if you remember, that was the war when Israel was caught by surprise. And in the first 3 or 4 days, people were wondering whether it would actually succeed in holding on. Some people knew there were already nuclear weapons available, so it could never be defeated, but it could also suffer greatly. But the Israelis, by about day 6, now had the upper hand. And they were pushing the Arab armies, particularly the 3rd Egyptian Army, very strongly. And essentially, OPEC then decided to use the oil weapon to put pressure on the Western countries to pressurize the Israelis to call a halt at an early stage. Now, that's a very, very quick snapshot. It's much more complicated than that for other factors. But that's essentially what happened. And they succeeded. But once oil prices started to rise, they just engineered a total rise of 70% virtually overnight. Now, we now worry when oil prices go up 5 or 6%. But that was what happened. And that set in the mother and father of all bear markets. Well, bull markets in terms of oil, bear market in terms of everybody else. Because essentially, oil prices rose by over 400% between October 73 and essentially May 74. And it caused global stagflation, which is a pretty rare phenomenon. And it caused a huge amount of rethinking about how economies work. While that was happening, the fruition of many changes in economic theory was starting to take place, which was essentially the rise of the neoliberal model. That had been around with the non-Panaron Society back in the late 40s in Switzerland. And you have people like Hayek and Friedman and the rest, who basically believed you should have an economic model which was much freer and more competitive, and much less state-centric, much more deregulated, less power to the unions, basically privatization of state assets. That would be more efficient and more effective and produce more economic growth. And the point is, with all the problems affecting the conventional system in the 1970s, that was what allowed the new one to come through, or at least speed up. And you had both the development of Thatcherism and, of course, Reaganomics in the very early 1980s. And during the 1980s, you had the changeover in many ways. Now, I know I'm saying a small amount about a huge change, and there are many complications, but essentially there was that change. And of course, it got a very big boost in, when was it, 1989-90, with almost the collapse of the main alternative, leaving China to one side. Essentially, the Soviet Union collapsed, and you had Russia left trying picking up its own pieces. And we should never forget that what Russia tried to do was to rush into basically a hyper-capitalist model. And the results were disastrous. Within 2 or 3 years, the best part of a third of the entire population of the Soviet Union, as it was, Russia, part of it now, was actually below the poverty line. The thing politically, which is very important in the current crisis, is that essentially Russia was viewed as a kind of failed state by Western states. And it's not being too much of an exaggeration to say that it was treated with contempt. And Putin has used that repeatedly. You know, Russians over 50 have a rather different view of how Russia was treated to Russians sort of at the age of 15, 20, 25 who didn't experience it. And it was a terrible period for Russians who are now over 50. And essentially that really helps speed things up in terms of the overall transition. And to some extent, people claimed who were very strong on the neoliberal side that it worked, that it was working well, that economic development, economic growth continued if you're focused on growth. In fact, it was rather lower in the 40 years after this change than the 40 years before. But the reality was what it did do was to create a much more differing society with much greater concentration of wealth in relatively small hands. And that essentially is the situation we've been experiencing over the last 20 years, with all sorts of problems developing from that, with more and more anger and resentment by people on the margins. And I would think also almost a kind of reason why we're getting so much basically right-wing populism, in which you blame the other side or some side for what is happening to you. And essentially, many of the sort of political norms seem to be under high pressure. We see it in many different parts of the world in many different ways. And to some extent, it produces extraordinary results because the neoliberal model itself is under threat to some extent by Trump's behavior, because of the way that, in a sense, tariffs are really trying to control an economy. And the whole principle from the neoliberal side is let it run free. That is what should. And there's quite a tussle going on there, you will find. And I think it's one of the reasons, if you look at it in a subtle way, why it is that when you see the reaction of Wall Street to the results of Trump's different changes and different changes of behavior almost, it relates really to what a more traditional economic free market model would go for, rather than what Trump is doing. And this is why, in fact, it is probably true that, as I think it was the Spectator, right-wing journal in Britain, basically said, I think it was yesterday or today, that essentially, in terms of the rounds of economic conflict between the United States and China, China has won this round. And I mean, we wouldn't expect Mr. Trump to admit that. Obviously, he sees it very differently. But that is what Wall Street is saying, which leaves the game with very big open areas. But I think the key thing about all of this is that if you take somebody like Trump, and many of the people around him, in Trump's case, really, I think you understand him by reference to just two words, self and wealth. Straightforward. He sees wealth and the power that comes from wealth as really at the root of power more generally. And also, he is not so much an egotist, he's a solipsist in terms of his own view of himself, which is a very tricky and potentially very dangerous combination, which adds to our current problems. But what I think is more important is we now are in an era in which relatively few extremely wealthy people are wielding extremely large economic power in many different ways. That's always been true to an extent. This isn't something new, but it is, I think, almost of an order of magnitude greater than what we had before. And what that means in many ways is that since this view of the world has no place at all for climate breakdown, indeed it does not believe it's happening, then essentially we have the double problem coming together. And I think we've got to look at what the interactions are in that. But let me just go, what can we time? We're already done. Yeah, I'll carry on for the time to see how we get on. Because I'd like to turn to the third one, which is the one of security. I think one place to start is that for Western armed forces that have been involved in the post-2002 9/11 wars, the post-9/11 wars, the last 24 years have been undeniable disasters. And let's not put it to, I see Todd nodding here, who spent quite a lot of time in the British Army during that period, or at least maybe a little bit before it. But essentially, it has been a disaster. Probably one of the leading centres for trying to work out the costs of war is the appropriately named Cost of War programme at the Watson Institute at Brown University, which is one of the lesser known but pretty significant basically Ivy League state universities in the United States. And they've done a particular study of what they call the post 9/11 wars. Now, I don't know what they're saying now, but certainly when I last checked 2.5 years ago, they costed the 9/11 wars at something like $8 trillion in terms of long effects. They cost in human lives, direct violence, to just under 1 million. Indirect violence, all the diseases, all the different problems that happen in intense war zones, that's about 4 million people. And something at that stage, 38 million people displaced. So essentially 38 million people displaced, 5 million people killed directly or indirectly by the wars, and essentially all of the wars to a greater extent or less failing. And we've seen by what's coming out about the special forces, not just British, the Australians have already looked into this, the Americans as well, what's been happening there in terms of when the push comes to shove in this kind of warfare. And essentially, it is very grim reading. Why do we get this sort of concentration so much in the military? It was Eisenhower, I think, back in 1960, in his closing address as President of the United States, who really popularized the use of the term military-industrial complex. And he referred to the first examples. There were, in fact, 2 examples. One, of course, was the Manhattan Project, a massive semi-secret, if not largely secret project, which led to the creation of the atom bomb. And also, I'm much more or less familiar with, but I'm told, there was a similar kind of thing on the electronic side, centered on MIT, which was hugely important in bringing in a whole range of new electronic systems, also about the same style. But those were very large combinations in which different people from different walks of life worked together on a kind of common cause. That became a model for military-industrial complexes. They are not just restricted to the United States or Britain or France or Germany. They certainly include Russia, certainly India, Pakistan, China, certainly countries that may have pretty sort of traditions of being rather more neutral. Sweden and Switzerland both have military-industrial complexes. They both produce and sell an awful lot of armaments. And essentially, it's been very good for them. Saab, the main Swedish thing, known for cars, but much more from the electric side, for the defense side, that, I think, doubled its value in the first 18 months of the Ukraine war. Rheinmetall, which is the big German land armor company, trebled its profits in the same, its wealth in the same time. And it turned out to be really very good for business. But military-industrial complexes have more to them than that. Reese mentioned I've been very lucky to do quite a lecturing at military colleges. And essentially, you can look at a military-industrial complex in Britain. Just one example. In the following way, you have the military, fair enough. Obviously, their job is to defend the realm. They see that and defend the realm. The officers are really very much seeing that in almost something related to the royal family, which is very strong. Basically, they want their careers, they want to develop things, and they want to make progress themselves. But essentially, that is where they're from. The same is true to an extent of the civil service who work in that area, and many civil servants tend to work in that particular area for quite a long time. And there are lots of interchanges. So you may actually find, the military, you might get a rising young military star who goes and joins the civil service for a while, seconded to a particular ministry. Or maybe one of the arms companies basically employs somebody like that. You find also that when people retire from the military, from the civil service, maybe given a short period of time, if they have any seniority, and if they're working in procurement and research and development, they will get very effective, actually very lucrative contracts to work with companies. And I've seen a number of cases where, I won't name names, but senior Labour politicians have ended up making a lot of money when they retire from politics. And 1 or 2 have done it when they're still in politics. And if they do it, you can guarantee the Conservatives will as well. So it's that as a whole. The military-industrial complex includes the military, includes the civil service, includes the industry. It includes think tanks, includes the intelligence agencies, and includes quite a lot of university departments. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be involved with the military in some ways. Peace studies has actually taught the military, but it's always done it on the basis of what it wants to teach. And the interesting thing is we do have students, and I'm not sure whether they're doing it now, certainly I've experienced in the past, who actually are, they're current students who are also in the military. And essentially they may come and do a set course for a week in peace studies, learning about the causes of terrorism, but taught by staff in peace studies who teach it the way they see it should be taught. It's not, you're not told how to teach it. And this is actually an indication that there are plenty of people in the military who will actually look at alternative views, which is why people like me end up getting asked to speak at these places, because they are more interested in that. I remember having a conversation with one quite senior person saying, oh, we'd be discussing climate change. And basically, I was asking him, well, why don't the military take more notice of this? Now, there are some exceptions. I think his name was Admiral Morissetti. Anybody nodding? He basically, I think, is now based at University College, having retired. I think he's very interested, has long been interested in the problems of climate breakdown. But those, I think, he was probably a bit of an exception. If I'm taking his name in vain, given that this is recorded, then I apologise. But certainly not all military see it this way. But by and large, the attitude within the military, and from their perspective, it's reasonable enough, is our job is to defend the realm from things that are going wrong now. How can we be expected to look 10 or 20 years' time and tell politicians that you've got to change your ways completely because we can't guarantee we'll keep you safe? Few military try to do that, but not very many. And I think that is one of the problems. There are other issues as well. Essentially, anybody who criticizes military policy, people who actually sold on military policy will just say, well, basically, you're unpatriotic. And there's also the issue constantly of secrecy. You know, you find what's happening now about the special forces is very worrying for parts of the Ministry of Defence, because, of course, traditionally, anything about the special forces was not made public. Politicians trying to get questions about the special forces, they'll be sort of batted away, essentially. This is now coming out into the open. I say it's not just Britain, it's many others. And I think it's a worry. But what it indicates is if you have secrecy as well as everything else, and the risk of being told you're unpatriotic, that militates against a more open debate about what kind of security policy we should have. There are very good people and very good groups who are trying to think this through. If you're interested in this, I would just Google rethinking security. I think the website is actually rethinkingsecurity.org. And that's a small outfit drawn from the likes of Oxfam and Christian Aid and the rest, who are trying to look at what security should mean for ordinary people, what it does ordinarily mean, and how we might sort of revamp the kind of attitude naturally that we have. I mean, personally, I can see a huge need to increase spending in some areas. We should be increasing we should be increasing security spending in areas like preparing for very difficult times with climate disasters and adapting many of our militaries to be able to do two different things, to do all the kind of work that you need in a disaster, which may need slightly more different equipment and a lot of training, and being ready for when the disaster comes, and working for all the NGOs who do such good work at present. There should be much higher levels of training in diplomacy and conflict resolution and mediation, and many other things as well. Those are the kinds of things. And I would also go for a huge increase in climate research. You know, they've produced that very interesting and very significant research ship, Sudan and Edinburgh. I would like to see 4 or 5 of those already in operation, because that is exactly the kind of science that we need to be able to work out what's happening. So I can ramble on and on a lot about this, I'm afraid. So let me try and sort of go on more to the more positive side if we can. The reality I would have to say is that as things are happening at present, we're in a very difficult time. I mean, candidly, I've been working in this kind of area, well, best part of 50 years, including nuclear stuff and terrorism and stuff. There have been 2 or 3 occasions when one has been really worried. As a 19-year-old student in London, I was around in London at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I have this very vivid memory of going up to Grosvenor Square on a very rainy autumn evening and watching about 50 protesters being allowed to go around in a circle just carrying their placards. I wasn't involved in CND and the rest, but I started joining soon afterwards because we realized how serious things could get. And there are other examples as well. People say, well, look, the Cold War is over, and we got through it, you know, it worked, deterrence worked. Very, very careful about that. There's so many occasions when we were extremely lucky. We got through the Cold War without it going hot, more by luck than by judgment. And it's interesting that some of the leading lights of the era, people like McNamara, who was Kennedy's defense secretary, General Lee Butler, who was the head of US Strategic Command, when they retired and could speak their minds, they were basically saying we must move towards nuclear disarmament. Even Kissinger took that to an extent. But we tend to forget we were lucky to get out of it. And one of the worries that people who work in the field now have is we're moving into an era of the possibility of small nuclear wars in far-off places. There was the use of small numbers of devices to serve a particular purpose. And that's probably the biggest single danger on the nuclear side at the present time. So essentially, we have all these risks, but we really know how to change them around. I mean, take the nuclear thing. I don't think too many people are aware that there is an active UN ban on nuclear weapons. I'm not up to date on how many countries have actually signed it. I think it's something like 70 already. And this is only after 4 years. And most of those now ratified it. So it's part of their law. The nuclear weapons are illegal. And that is still growing. It's okay, the existing nuclear powers are not signing up to it, the alliances are not signing up to it, but a lot of countries are, including countries like South Africa, I think Austria now, and certainly Mexico and others have signed up to it. There is this counter movement which we tend to forget. We're not going to get the control of the nuclear issue easily. And the real worry is you might actually have to have a small nuclear war which wakes people up. But that is terribly dangerous. And this is why it must be an absolute last resort. But at least you can do that. And as I say, there's lots of thinking going on about how to look at security in a very different way. Because ordinary people, most of the time, do. They're looking at their own positions, their own worries, and how they meld together and how they can be approached and how they can sort of come up to responding to them. And in a sense, you have a system which relatively small groups of people, and this in Britain and other countries, who are in the senior levels in these military industrial complexes, tend to have a pretty common view of the world, I'm afraid. Somebody did actually say that as far as they could see, you tended to get an environment of hegemonic masculinity in the whole system. And that is certainly true to a large extent. But that can change. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that we have very big problems ahead. It was summarized, in my view, by a very interesting guy by the name of Edwin Brooks. You may have heard me mention this quote before. He was an economic geographer at Liverpool University back in the 1960s and 70s. He was president of the Conservation Society. He also did 4 years as a Labour MP. And he was asked to take part in a conference in which he was asked to say, well, what kinds of world should we look forward to? And he looked on the positive side, but then he said, you've also got to look at the dystopia. As he summarized, I'll give you the exact quote, the risk is of a crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth buttressed by stark force, yet endlessly threatened by desperate men in the global ghettos of the underprivileged. Now, the use of the term desperate men dates him somewhat, obviously. The use of the term underprivileged is an interesting one, because I think people don't tend to talk much about privilege. But that is a very interesting way of looking at the way in which elite systems worked. So what basically Brooks was saying, that is what we would be heading for. And that was in 1973, so that would be 52 years ago, and essentially much closer. Incidentally, Brooks emigrated to Australia. Last I heard, he was in his 90s and still politically active, which gives hope for all of us, I suppose. What I'm trying to say is that we're at a very important time. I know that in giving these kinds of talks, people like me at some stage say, now is the important time, because we've got to do this before that. I actually think that is true at the present time, that there are very big changes that are going to happen. Can we envisage anything which might make it happen quicker without huge loss of life? One is risky. And that is, we do find over the next 4 or 5 years, in fact, we're virtually certain to find there will be major climate disasters. We've been pretty lucky so far. Some of the basically heat mounds, the heat domes, as they call them, that have hit parts of Canada, we're very lucky that it wasn't a city, that it was out in the open. Some of the floods, well, we've seen floods. Remember that, what was it, the Libyan port of Derna? Remember 3 years ago, there was a massive rainstorm in the hills and mountains, I think probably about 100 miles inland. from Derna, which is a coastal city. And a huge pile of water came down, smashed two dams, and it basically went right through the centre of the city and carved an area out, sort of maybe 300 or 400 feet across, right through the heart of the city. They don't know how many people were killed, but it was in the thousands. Certainly the low thousands of people died in a matter of minutes. It wasn't widely reported, but it was an example of the kind of disaster you have. Now, the thing is, if you've got that on a much larger scale, affecting one of the largest cities of the global north, would that be the kind of thing which would shift things around? Do we have to wait that long? Well, we do, unless we can be better prepared earlier. But this is where the balance comes in. I've got a definition of prophecy, which is basically, prophecy is suggesting the possible. And if you're saying to people, these are the kinds of things which could be done now by what we know about already, and that applies to how quickly we could start to decarbonize, how quickly we could start to work out better economic models, which were more fair for more people. There are all sorts of ways we can do things now. The more those ideas are out, and maybe even being explored in different ways, the more, if we do have the beginnings of disasters, will speed up the way in which people actually respond. Going back to that Danish program, you know, Families Like Ours, what that was really saying was nobody really took it really seriously until it was too late. And even then, they tried to keep life living more or less their own way. And what we're saying really is you've got to be prepared to change things and to be prepared to show that that can be done quickly and effectively. It's worth remembering that if I'm right, and to correct me if I'm wrong, I think currently there are about 950 million people worldwide who are members of co-ops or mutuals. There are alternative systems already working in different ways. If you look at the Mondragon group of cooperatives in northern Spain, astonishingly successful, and they work on a cooperative basis. And there's lots of alternatives, even on the economic side, if you get the kind of political mood which allows that to be favoured. So there are all sorts of things we can do. As individuals, it's always daunting, particularly at the present time. I must be candid, I got more depressed about the state of the world than I have in my entire career recently. Maybe it's just a thing of age, but certainly it is a very difficult time. But at the same time, there are an awful lot of people wanting and hoping to do something about it. You know, somebody who might be working in human rights or the arms trade or climate change or something else, they may be doing very good work in their own area. They're part of a much wider thing and need to see themselves as part of a much wider thing, because it can be basically self-supporting for them. There's always the need to have more knowledge, but not an over. You want to go for the knowledge that actually helps you. So I think really, perhaps we are in the period for the next 5 years. Perhaps I can say this in my early 80s, you know, I might even see some of this. The point is that maybe we are at the point where things can change very quickly. I mean, they've changed a heck of a lot in the last 6 months for a start. They can change for the better as well, if people are ready to push it along as it starts to happen. That, to me, is one of the things that you can hang on to in terms of maybe beginning to move towards a more peaceful world, which I'm sure is the great majority of us actually really want. I've gone on a bit longer than expected, I'm afraid. We still do have time for questions and the rest. So shall we just take a 2-minute comfort break? Stretch our legs if we want, and then I'll leave in your good hands, actually, if I may, to take it forward. I'll just go and get that.